What is macroevolution? Well, we've spent some time talking about microevolution, which looked at changes in allele frequencies. Macroevolution, on the other hand, wants to look at speciation events. So first we have to know what a species is. I have this picture up for you because we'll talk about the idea that particular alleles are selected for in a population, and over time you can actually lose some of those alleles because we select for particular phenotypes, because we are driving, in the human population at least, selection in a very artificial way versus a natural selection kind of way. And so what we'll think about is this combination of genes that contribute to particular traits, a phenomenon we've talked about before as polygenic inheritance. But how does that actually lead to some sort of speciation event? I'm not suggesting that red-headed people are a separate species. What I'm suggesting is that we have to consider all of the alleles in a population to understand how changes in speciation events can occur. So what defines a species? Well, it depends who you ask. Species, by definition, must interbreed. So this means you cannot put two individuals together from two different species, and if they don't interbreed, what we look at is they are two different species. This is a very old definition because now we can see hybrid in particular species, but when we look at this, it's a quick and dirty definition for species. It's been modified to suggest that they are a taxonomic group that can interbreed, meaning that they only will breed with individuals of the same species. Again, kind of a cut and dry definition, but not necessarily applicable to all situations. A single distant class of living creature with features that distinguish it from others. Well, now we're just getting fluffy. So there are all kinds of these definitions available. But what we want to think about is that the idea of species doesn't always work. We can put all of these fancy definitions to it, but there are many things on this planet that you can't think of as species based on the definition of simply, do they breed? Bacteria don't breed. They're asexual. They divide themselves. Is that breeding? No. So trying to understand bacteria as a species is actually very, very difficult. We define bacteria as strains, not as species, because, as I have here, it would take over 1 million breeding experiments to really understand what's going on with bacteria. Other problems, hybridization. We've seen plants that hybridize. You know that some animals hybridize. So this mix of genes, and all of a sudden you have what you would consider a new species, but is it really, because it's just a mix of two species? Who knows? Are these two different species? Based on their phenotypes, just looking at these, you might suggest not. You might say, no, they're the same species. Actually, they're different. One is actually an endangered species and is very protected. The other is just a basic barn owl. So when we look at this process of trying to define species on phenotype or morphology, you'll find very quickly this doesn't work for us. This idea of a biological species concept comes up. So looking at whether or not the members of the population have the potential to interbreed. Not that they do, but they have the potential to. Well, this is kind of a weird definition too, right? So what I want you to think about is, in evolution, what we're looking for is a change in allele frequencies to find a new population or a new species. So in order to have a change in allele frequencies, you have to have a significant change in the population, right? If two populations breed with one another, If you could find a mate in Ohio, really, you're not looking at two different species, right? So the result is it stays one population or one species. We don't get a speciation event. But if there's no breeding between the two populations, so if there's some sort of geographical divide, the Grand Canyon is often an example that's used. The squirrels on the north rim of the Grand Canyon are not going to travel to the south rim of the Grand Canyon to find a mate. Not going to happen. So in this case, over time, you could get two different species of squirrels on the north and south side of the Grand Canyon. What we look for is whether or not in a population is there reproductive isolation. If there is, if a population is divided, we can look over time that this will prevent gene flow and will actually maintain separate species for us. If we have a chance to look at two populations that border one another, that live close by, near one another, what we want to know is, given the opportunity, will they breed? If they will, they're the same species. Okay? They're sharing a gene pool. If there's some sort of reproductive barrier that keeps them from interbreeding, this could be geographical, like we talked about with the Grand Canyon, but this could also be something wrong with the individuals themselves that keep them from interbreeding. We look at gamete incompatibility, okay, and other issues associated with that. I have them here for you, a couple of them. Prezygotic means pre-fertilization, right, before the actual zygote is formed, and then we have postzygotic after fertilization. Okay, so things like isolation. If you've separated a population by habitat or by the way they behave, or mechanical refers to whether or not basically the parts fit between the males and females. If we look at these kind of isolation events, you can assume that over time these individuals will no longer interbreed and will end up with two different species. But postzygotic, you can have all kinds of issues with hybrids. Some of them will actually produce quite fertile offspring. Others produce offspring, but they're not fertile. So there's all kinds of possibilities here, and we'll look at some of them as we talk. Things like reduced hybrid fertility, meaning that you can combine a horse and a donkey. We do this all the time. We form mules. Okay, so our mule here is actually sterile. Okay, so the individual obviously exists between a horse and a donkey. The offspring exists, but that offspring cannot breed with another mule and produce mule offspring. To get another mule, you have to go back and cross another donkey and another horse, and you get another mule then. Now, some of these interesting traits are that you could take a mule and cross it with a different donkey, preferably not its parent. Cross this with another donkey or another horse, and you can get some type of offspring in many cases. So we also have all kinds of other options that are now pretty common. Mule is probably the most common, but ligers have become very common. Zorses and Lepons have become very common. But again, the offspring, this hybrid offspring, is typically not highly fertile, and if it is fertile at all, it's only going to be fertile with a parental strain, not with itself.